Professor Daniel, I am so happy and honored to have this conversation with you today. Welcome to afikra.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Thank you. So Professor Daniel is the Director of Studies in the School of Modern Languages and Cultures at Durham University in the UK. His interest in food is related to his research into medieval Islamic medicine, especially sexuality and erythology, which resulted in a book on aphrodisiacs in the Middle Ages entitled The Sultan's Sex Potions. He recently completed an edition and translation of a magnificent 15th-century cookbook, or cookery manual would be the proper way to perhaps describe it, entitled as Zahr al-Hadiqa fi al-At'ima al-Aniqa. Translates to Garden Flowers in Elegant Foods. And it contains over 300 amazing recipes. He has widely published a number of books on Arabic geographical and travel literature, with special focus on Arabic travels to Europe in the 19th century. And in 2009, he was the co-recipient of the award of the President of the Republic of Tunisia for Islamic Studies for the book entitled Muslim Women and Law and Society. He has other works, including An Imam in Paris, Arabic-English thematic lexicon, modern Arabic short stories, and A to Z of Arabic-English Arabic translation and Arabic-English Arabic translation, two books, one on perhaps a general one, and the other one is the issues and strategies specific, and a final book on Rifa'a al-Tahtawi, a 19th century Egyptian educationalist and reformer. A very warm welcome to you, Professor Daniel. I would love to know how your interest first started in Arabic literature, but also in food, and perhaps how your career journey has changed over time.
Yes, that's a good word, journey. It's been a journey on a very winding road, with plenty of turns and plenty of unexpected departures and arrivals. Well, I did a degree in Arabic language and literature, a graduate of SOAS, and it's already when I was a student that I developed an interest in geographical literature. And of course, the link between travelers, travel writing, and intercultural contact is a very obvious one, a very narrow one. And then I also, being involved in translation studies, developed an interest in the history of translation studies. And this, of course, particularly is always with a link to Arabic. And of course, this means that you started thinking about the translation movement in the Middle Ages, as well as the 19th century afterwards. This also was linked to work I was doing on medieval Islamic medicine. And of course, the translation movement, many of the works that were translated were in medicine. And of course, it is thanks to these translations to Arabic that many of the original Greek works that had been lost in Europe, that they subsequently, following translation of the Arabic words into Latin, slightly later, so the 12th, 13th centuries, that Europe once again gained access to that heritage. And you can't really research Islamic medicine without also researching food. Without going into detail, it's of course part of, or the approach is one that that is known as the humoral system, developed by the ancient Greeks. Think of people like Hippocrates and of course the great Galen. And so it's a very holistic approach to health, within which food occupies a central role. So initially they were inspired by the Greeks. So as I said, people like Galen, but also Dioscorides, of course, the great botanist. but Arabic scholars, I say Arabic because obviously not all of them were Arabs. They wrote in Arabic, but they were not all Arabs, nor were they all Muslims, of course. Ibn Sina was Persian, and we have people like Ibn Butlan, who, of course, was a Christian. Yeah. So, but they all wrote in Arabic. And the Arabic scholars greatly developed and enhanced that system. And so this is how I really got into food, if you will, as well as being a natural foodie as well. I've been fortunate in that I've traveled widely and lived in a variety of places. And food has always been a particular interest. And so it's in a way this wonderful combination of a passion, which then has informed my research work.
That's an amazing journey. And I love what it resulted in, and the knowledge you were able to share with us throughout. Especially my favorite, the Sultan's Feast. I'm gonna go back to its Arabic title, زهر الحديقة في الأطعمة الأنيقة, right? And I love these medieval titles, the Arabic medieval titles, because there's this poetics and rhyming playfulness of words that perhaps we don't see as much these days. And maybe largely it kind of tells us more about the use of language in, of course, literature at large, but also in cookbooks specifically. And, especially that given the fact that perhaps cookbooks are often overlooked as a legitimate source or a genre of literature in its own right, and that deserves its own field of studies even. So in your opinion, what can language tell us about food and in extension about history?
A great deal. If we go to the title again, of course, this is a very classical Arabic device, tajanus, this play on sound, which we have. I mean, any kind of medieval Arabic work has these wonderful titles, which in and of themselves often don't really mean that much, but it's all about the sound, and it's about, I guess, a mood that's being created. And in the cookery books, we have an interesting split, actually. We have cookery books that have these elegant titles, so aniq, like the Sultan's Feast, or الوصلة إلى الحبيب في وصف الطيبات والطيب. But then others have a much more prosaic, a much more down-to-earth title, and simply, Book of Cookery, Tibaha, or Kitab al-Tabikh. And so I think this already gives us a little indication as to the type of literature that we're dealing with. And so it's by no means a homogeneous genre. If we look at what is considered to be the oldest, although the oldest manuscript doesn't go back as far, the oldest has been placed in the 10th century. That work really is the odd one out in the collection, in that it's a cookery book, but much more. It contains poetry. In short, it's part of this genre in Arabic literature, which is very difficult to circumscribe, which is, of course, adab. And the word adab in Arabic today, of course, simply means literature. It can also mean, of course, morals. Think of qism al-adab, in Egypt, for instance. But it really refers to what we can call etiquette as well. etiquette, but etiquette with a moral or moralistic dimension. And so works of adab are essentially the works of what a sophisticated gentleman would have to know. And so this should be viewed as in civilized company. And so nice stories, good food, good drink. And this genre is clearly visible in that first book by a man called El-Warraq, the bookseller. And then we have other books where, as I say, it's simply cookery book, which no longer have such pretensions, if one can use that word. And so there is a development also in the genre in terms of the intended readership, because of course, many of the cookery books would also have been used in the kitchens. They were not intended to be read of an evening, although the book by El-Warraq definitely can also be enjoyed in that sense because of its literary dimension. The other thing that's striking in terms of language, and which tells us a little bit about the development of the genre, is that in that very same work, there is a considerable medical dimension. Now, this medical information was by no means original. This was taken from the great works of medicine by people like Ibn Sina, Al-Razi, people of that kind, Sabur ibn Sahal, and so on. So from medical and pharmacological literature. But nevertheless, it to me reveals very clearly the origins, or one of the two origins of the genre, which is that it grew out of pharmacological literature. And we have actually a number of early pharmacological works that also contain a number of recipes. Most famously, the work by Ibn Jazla, on whom I've been working for quite a number of years, whose work contains over 200 culinary recipes, in addition to all of the other entries that one would expect in what is, after all, a pharmacological encyclopedia. So language in that sense is important. Now, going back to my earlier point about the development in the titles, what is interesting is that we have the Sultan's Feast. We're now in the 15th century. So we're now, if you like, half a millennium after the first book by El-Warraq. And in fact, of course, many others are known by their titles only. Probably they were already being produced earlier, and there's even a wide variety of people that are involved in the writing, which also says something about the importance of food, which then goes back to my point about the connection between food, medicine, general health. So food as part of a therapy, so therapeutic uses. In the 15th century, we have this very literary title, and I think there's two ways in which to interpret that. Either we can say that this is the author trying to make sure that it's clear that he's writing a serious book, it's a work of literature, or perhaps he is very conscious of the fact that he's part of a tradition. And the traditional element is a very significant one. I think there's a strong case to be made, because when it comes to authorship, we're often in a bit of a quandary with the cookery manuals. It's very dangerous, to my mind, to talk in terms of authors, and perhaps the word compiler is much more accurate. In the case of the Sultan's Feast, for instance, there's a large number of recipes that can be found in an earlier Egyptian manual, Kanz al-Fawaid, in addition to recipes that one can find in Al-Wusla al-Habib, as well as in Ibn Jazla's work, and of course also recipes that are not found in any other source. Right. So I think what we are looking at is at one point a kind of common pool of recipes that varied and to which people added recipes with other recipes, of course, falling by the wayside as time went on. And time goes on and palates change. And so certain recipes are no longer as popular as they used to be, or they are retained, but in a slightly different format, or with different ingredients. And so there's a lot going on that we can talk about in terms of the language that's used. The language, of course, also is important in terms of tracing the origins of dishes. And so just a few examples. There was a very, very significant Persian strand in early Arab cooking. This, of course, came from the Sassanid Empire, which had a very elaborate courtly culture. And so many of the dishes in El-Warraq's work, for instance, have Persian names. They're Persian words, particularly all these things like sigbaj and so on and so forth. And even the names sometimes of fruit, zirishk for barberries. And so we also find that as time goes on, that earlier substrate also changes. So the terminology changes. The language, of course, also tells us other things. For instance, Egypt is clearly responsible for kunafa, because kunafa can already be found in Coptic and probably goes back much further than that to ancient Egypt. We'd have to ask our friend and colleague, Dr. Menna, about that to have confirmation. And of course, kak. Kak is also an Egyptian invention, and of course was already used in Coptic to refer to a baked loaf or a cake. And then, of course, there's the other side of the Mediterranean. There's ancient Greece and Rome. And then we have things like, for instance, murri. Murri, which is that fermented condiment, the mystery condiment, which I only recently just recreated one version of it, not the 40 days in the sun rotting version, because we don't have that much sunshine in the northeast of England. So it was a kind of express version, but delicious nonetheless, which probably goes back to the Latin muria, which is brine, and that goes back to the Greek for salty, el muris.
Liquamen? What is it called? Am I pronouncing it right? Liquamen, perhaps?
Liquamen, exactly. It's that liquamen is like garum, exactly. It's that part. So muria, liquamen, garum.
It's very close to a modern fish sauce. If
exactly.
Okay, all right.
Exactly. And that's one theory, that it goes back to Latin. I however, think that is not quite correct. And I mean, other people have said, well, it's the Arabic mur, bitter, which makes a lot of sense. I think actually that is a valid point. On the other hand, I think it actually goes back to the Akkadian word murru, so the language of the ancient Mesopotamia, so Assyrian, where murru meant bitter taste. So we have two contenders, if you like, whether it's the Greek-Latin root or whether it's the Mesopotamian root. I'd like to think that it's the ancient Mesopotamian root. So yes, it tells us a lot, language tells us a lot about the development of the recipes and the cookery books. And by extension, of course, it also tells us a lot, because food does, I think, always tell us a lot about the way society is changing.
Absolutely. The author of The Sultan's Feast, Ibn Mubārak Shāh, right? You mentioned in your introduction, which is amazing, by the way. I think it's one of the most comprehensive introductions on medieval culinary literature that I always refer back to understand and give a nice context to the topic at the time. But in the introduction, you mentioned that little is quite known about him, other than the fact that he was a poet and a scholar. Yet you were really effectively able to form a nice idea from hints throughout the book about him. What more can you tell us about Mubārak Shāh?
Well, the book tells us quite a lot about him in the context that we're talking about. And by extension, it also allows us to gain a better insight, I believe, into the authorship, or I should correct myself, compilership of the cookery books. And so who is Ibn Mubārak Shāh, and why did he write the cookery book is the question that we should be asking. So here we have a scholar, and the cookery book was written, if you piece all of the information together, to a large extent as a kind of, excuse me, recipe book that was used in the Ibn Mubārak Shāh household. And so essentially, just as you or I, when we find a recipe that we like, we cook it and we write it down, and it's saved. And if at some point in the future you feel like eating it, you go back to your cookery book. You may ask your friends, how do you make that dish, and so forth. You may also copy recipes from other cookery books. So all of this we can find very, very clearly, very obviously in Ibn Mubārak Shāh's book. He also gives us an insight into the type of person he is. So he, in terms of his socioeconomic background. So here, if we look at the works of Al-Warraq, for instance, that it clearly reflects almost exclusively the cuisine of the elite, the royal courts. And to a lesser or greater extent, that remains the case throughout the next 5 centuries in which the cookery books are written, with some exceptions. Now, Ibn Mubārak Shāh is interesting in that we find recipes that are very much part of that elite cuisine, but we also find a number of recipes that are really there to be enjoyed in kind of what we today would call middle-class households. And how do we know this? Well, for instance, he makes very clear references to the fact that, you know, I taught my servants to make this dish, but of course, we didn't use this or that ingredient. We replaced it with something cheaper in order to suit our family's income.
Amazing. Yeah.
So forget about the musk, forget about the ambergris, forget about the nutmeg or cinnamon. Use cassia. Use a bit more of something that is cheaper to get hold of. The other thing that's quite interesting is that he mentions, for instance, and this is almost kind of gold dust for the historian, what is it that people made at home? Because obviously let's say people of a lower socioeconomic background, of course, they didn't have kitchens and so on. So what did they do? What did they eat? And so here again, he will make references to even in his household, you know, if you don't have time to make this ingredient, just go to the market and purchase it ready-made. So that's another very interesting indication and clue as to how things would work. So his book is this wonderful combination of high and medium brow cuisine, if we can call it that. And so in that sense, it's very significant. The third element that comes out of the book, where he gives some very interesting information, both implicit and explicit, is the change that was taking place as a result of Turkish influence. And of course, he's writing at a time when soon, in fact, less than 50 years after his death, of course, Egypt becomes part of the Ottoman Empire. At the time, it's still the Mamluk. And so he mentions, for instance, a number of Turkish dishes. And he even, on one occasion, he lists a variant of a particular recipe. And he says, if you're making it for a Turk, make sure to use some garlic steeped in olive oil.
Wow.
So this tells us what? This tells us that there were enough of them about in order for the author to be aware of these culinary differences. But of course, it also tells us that there was already intercultural contact between the communities. And of course, that is what food is all about. You can't go to war when you're eating, and war stops when one eats. Arguments stop. Arguments with friends, with loved ones, they stop when we sit down to eat. And so it's that kind of intercultural contact that is also very evident, I think, in the cookery books. And then the final strand in that intercultural contact, of course, is the various ingredients from all over the known world. And so it's clear that there was a lot of contact. Whether it's pears from this country, whether it's quince from Syria, or whether it's cheese from where, or of course, in terms of recipes, one of the dishes in the Sultan's feast, of course, is couscous. Couscous, which by then had traveled from the west to the east and became very popular because at one point, when the Turkish traveler Evliya Çelebi visits Egypt, he actually talks about couscous being a very popular dish amongst the Egyptians.
Mm.
So it's this kind of movement, these intercultural movements, that make it such a passionate and endlessly interesting topic.
That's really interesting. Absolutely. I mean, I had a question specific to how the book or the manuscript perhaps tells us about the cuisine in ways that make it different or perhaps similar from other or previous medieval cookbooks from the time, from the region. But you mentioned the Turkish influence, for instance, that makes it very specific to the time and very specific to the region, or to Egypt. It's locale. What about in the Mamluks' time? I mean, Mamluks originated from the Caucasus, you'd say places like Armenia, modern day Armenia, or modern day Georgia, Circassians as well, where I assume made up a lot of the Mamluks population in the army, in the Mamluks army. So what would you say any traces or influences of such ethnicities that you might have noticed in the book?
Well, there's the recipes I mentioned. One of them being, for instance, yogurt, yogurt, which already can be found in Kanz al-Fawaid, which dates from the late 13th or 14th century. However, when it comes to specific areas like the ones you're talking about, so Circassian food and so on, I think that's much more difficult to pinpoint. And of course, we don't really know when exactly these dishes entered, but there's others, for instance, that generally one can talk about a Turkic influence. And there's things like tutmaj, which is a kind of a pasta, we call it kind of a tagliatelle avant la lettre, if you will. But any more precise than that, I think, is difficult, because obviously we should be very careful not to apply current geopolitical constellations to the past, because we're talking about areas or states, nation states in many cases today, which cannot necessarily be extrapolated towards a situation in the Middle Ages. And of course, you know, when it comes to Ottoman cuisine itself initially was very influenced by Arab cuisine. And the oldest Ottoman cookery book, of course, was based on an Arabic book by a man called al-Baghdadi, the only one to have survived in an autograph, so written by the man himself from the 13th century, to which the Ottoman author also added other recipes. But then, of course, we enter another phase of the story, and it's one where, of course, as you know, after the 15th century, we then have no cookery books anymore until the 19th century. And then, of course, Arab cuisine becomes a different animal altogether. That's a page from the anonymous Andalusian cookery book, 13th century as well.
13th century, that's amazing. Yeah, I mean, I was supposed to flip through the presentation slides earlier than now, but I've been taken by a conversation. And this is from Zahr al-Hadiqa, right?
Exactly. This is the cover of Zahr al-Hadiqa, في العاطمة الأنيقة. And this is the only known manuscript copy. That's the other thing. There are some works that were real bestsellers, and of which there are a number of manuscripts. Al-Musal al-Habib, for instance, is a good example. And in terms of the, now I'm going back to a question you raised earlier, a very interesting one, in terms of the appreciation or the literary appreciation or lack thereof of cookery books. Now, generally this was the case, but then we have, for instance, that same al-Baghdadi whom I've mentioned. In the British Library, there's a wonderful copy, gold embossed, that was made for the Ottoman Sultan. And so clearly it was considered important enough for it to be given to the Sultan. And of course, that copy would not have been used in the palace kitchens, one would imagine.
Wow. Yeah, for sure. You wouldn't have a gilded book on a humble kitchen counter.
No.
I follow your Instagram page, and I love it, and I think it's amazing. Do you cook historical recipes every day? Because this is what you post almost every day, a new recipe, and it just makes me wonder, how do you have the time? And I'm sure the process itself is really interesting to be kind of recreating these recipes, and I'm sure it enlightens you know, and informs of things that might be completely different on paper, but once you actually make it, you learn so much more.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things that, I mean, it's been a passionate journey. In fact, I should say that I'm very blessed. My work is also my hobby. And so I'm very, very fortunate in that. And originally the recreations started as a hobby. And my partner also took to it with great gusto and aplomb. But it quickly became much more than that, in that, as you rightly point out, by making the recipes, often I would find out things that the texts had somehow, that had eluded me in the text, because these recipes, of course, remember that they're usually written for chefs. And just as today, when a chef writes a recipe for another chef, this is very different from a recipe that's made for a home cook. Just as recipes for dishes that are made in a restaurant have nothing to do with the recipes from a cookery book, because obviously, if you want to serve a stew, you can't start by preparing everything and then telling your guests you have to wait for 2 hours before we can serve it. So those are two very different things. And so in the recipes, one is often at a loss and thinking, okay, there is a stage missing here, but what is it? How did they get from A to B? And of course, we have to assume that they knew what they were talking about. By recreating it, by trial and error, you find out, okay, this is how it works. So it's actually been a journey of discovery which has informed my research as well. And then we come to the very difficult and often intractable question of the ingredients and the measures. So when it comes to ingredients, of course, there are many things that one cannot pick up from the local grocery store. And so one of the things that I do whenever I travel is that I will always schedule a visit to an attar or several in order to acquire the more unusual things. So over the years, I've acquired things like musk, ambergris, all of these mastic, all of these ingredients, which are also used in the cooking. And then, of course, it comes to measurements. You know, they, again, from one chef to another, he will say, add salt now. Now, the chef knows it's a pinch, it's a handful, or be generous. In the beginning, you have to really kind of measure out, and sometimes the result is perhaps not as palatable as it should have been. But of course, as you become more experienced, and now I can say with confidence that I can easily detect almost exactly what they would have enjoyed in a particular dish. And it's almost by taste now that one can tell, okay, they would really have enjoyed this, or this actually would have tasted differently. And of course, there are limitations because not all ingredients can be found. And even the ones that are found are, of course, not necessarily the same one. So the present day celery is not necessarily celery of 1,000 years ago, carrots and so on and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, I love mastic. I cook with it. I'm obsessed with mastic. I talk about it wherever and whenever I can. But I've never cooked with musk or tasted something with musk. How is cooking with musk like, and where do you find it? Is there a local attar?
No.
That you can recommend?
Musk, I have to think back now where I acquired it. I think it may have been in Tunis, in the Souq al-Atarin. I may have acquired it. The internet is actually also quite useful in that, so for instance, talking about even more exotic ingredients like the Myro balance, the amlaj, balilaj, halilaj, things of that nature. Those are things that are very popular in India. Those are things that I acquire on the internet. But so musk, of course, isn't used very often, and it really is there to perfume the dish, if you like. Mastic, I have to say, I'm quite surprised that you use it a lot, because one of the things that I have a problem with,
the bitterness?
Yes, it's so powerful because you only use literally a pinch, but it's so bitter that I find it very difficult to disguise it. One of the other things that used to bother me in the first recreations was the vinegar. So almost every recipe, you need vinegar. And after a while, I really couldn't stand the vinegariness anymore. But then, of course, you start to think, well, hang on, we're using present-day vinegar, but in fact, they had many different types of vinegar. And so recently, we made homemade vinegar.
Oh, no way.
And grape vinegar, which is absolutely fantastic. And lo and behold, we remade the sigbaj, which is a vinegar stew from the Persian sikh vinegar baj stew, so extremely vinegary, and I made it with the homemade vinegar, also a recipe from, of course, the Middle Ages, and lo and behold, the taste was not at all as vinegary as the other one. So here, once again, when a chef says vinegar, sometimes they do specify wine vinegar, but often they would have used, this is the only way to explain the different types of vinegar as recipes. They would have used specific vinegars for specific recipes. It makes perfect sense. Just as today we use balsamic vinegar in salads, but we wouldn't use it to fry. So it's all of these things. So in answer to your question, well, yes, we make a lot of recipes. And of course, the Instagram is only part of it because I also have the blog where I also every week have at least 1 or 2 entries where I also get a chance to give a little bit more background. So there's the recipes, but then there's also a series of what I call spotlight, where I discuss ingredients, where I discuss kitchen hacks, what would the cooks have done, or cooking methods, for instance, the types of ovens they would have used for which dishes and so on. So yes, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. It takes up a lot of time, but it's a
commitment. That's really, really inspiring. I mean, I do have my own Instagram page, Sufra Kitchen, and I try as much.
Yes, I love it.
Thank you. To share what I encounter in my research on food history. But yeah, like cooking almost every week is extremely difficult. I can only imagine how it's like with you chairing a department, working on a book, and managing a blog and doing your own research as well. So this is amazing. And on mastic, by the way, I usually, first of all, the bitterness, definitely, it has to, a little goes a long way with mastic. Yeah. And I use it with rice dishes. It's something that my grandmother and my mother and a lot of Egyptians do it with mastic rice.
Absolutely.
And things that are milky and sweet. Some halabiyya.
Like a rice pudding?
Yes, absolutely. A rice pudding. Good rice pudding has a nice, a good amount of rose water and mastic. And that's like heaven for me, really. I want to go back to the one point about health. And the link to medicinal knowledge. And it seems like it was such an important thing. I mean, almost, in a lot of these recipes, I want to say almost all of them, you'd correct me if I'm wrong, there is references to its medicinal uses, its balancing properties to, the humoral, linking back to the humoral theory. Do you think that was the case for the normal average Egyptian in the 15th century? Were they that health conscious, or is it perhaps a case of cookbooks being expectations rather than what was reality at the time? Were they things that people just thought of as ideal, and they looked up, or thought that perhaps I'll write it in hopes that people would follow it, or was that perhaps a more reflection of how things were like?
I to some extent, because the picture is a little bit more complicated, I think. The amount of medical information varies considerably. There are some works that have none whatsoever. There are those that have a very high content, and where there's even separate, Mubārak is a good example, where there's chapters devoted to the medicinal properties of ingredients and so on and so forth. The Sultan's Feast is somewhere in between. That's one thing. And the other is that the cookery books, those that have medical information, so the medical information comes in a couple of guises. The first is, as you pointed out, so there's a dish or an ingredient that says, okay, this is good for, in cold climates, or this is good for whatever. But there's also a category of recipes that are clearly only medicinal. But that's not to say that they weren't also enjoyed for their own sake. And one of the things that is very significant in medieval Islamic medicine, and if we take we always have to go back to the greats, Razi, Ibn Sina, the importance of good taste and medicine. So it has to taste nice as well. And that is very significant. And of course, then that also leads us into religion, because in medieval Europe, which was suffering under the oppressive weight of the Catholic Church, where you can't enjoy life. In the Muslim world, of course, the injunction was the opposite. It was to enjoy the benefits that are given by creation. Now, of course, that is not to say that when a king organized a huge banquet, he did so for religious reasons necessarily. He wanted to show off how rich he was. But there is nonetheless that dimension of enjoying what is made available by God, and also, of course, in terms of sharing. In Muslim Arab culture, there is no virtue greater than generosity. There is no vice greater than being a miser, being mean. And to this day, when you say of somebody that he is mean, he's bakhil, that is still an insult, even just as it was in pre-Islamic times, in the days of the Bedouins, where really generosity, sharing. And of course, then we have another dimension that's brought in with the big banquets, is that it was a way of the ruler to tie the populace, to tie the citizenry to the ruling family, because we organize a banquet, and of course, everything that is left over would be donated to the poor as zakat. So there's a large number of dimensions here. But so the medical information, why was it retained in the Sultan's feast? If we end with that point, I believe that in that period, probably the intended readership wasn't as interested in that aspect. But I think Ibn Mubārak Shāh, above all else, so he writes his own recipe book, but he is also a great anthologist. And in fact, he's not the best poet, but he is a great collector of poems. And so his book is also an anthology of past culinary greatness. And of course, little does he know that his anthology is very necessary, because very soon the world will change completely.
That's amazing, for sure. These are some images that we're seeing from your blog of recipes that you have recreated. And we've asked you to perhaps pick only one dish that you would be, that you'd present to us today. So you chose Qahiriyya. It sounds really intriguing, carrying the name of Al-Qahira, Cairo. And also, the fact that it's marzipan, correct? Or is it close to marzipan? And
yes,
then
exactly. Yeah, exactly.
As a donut and dipped in honey. I mean, it sounds like heaven.
Yeah. It is heaven on a plate. It's the kind of thing that you start eating, and then just one more. I won't have lunch. One more, I won't have dinner. I'm still waiting when I can start having lunch again, because I had so many of them. It's a wonderful dish for two reasons. The one is the one that you've just mentioned. It is just addictive in its goodness. And so you're right. So it's essentially almonds and sugar and flour, and then of course it's kind of kneaded into a dough, and then you have a batter, and of course they're dipped in the batter. There's also dipping in honey and syrup and all those other good things, and then deep fried. Before sprinkling on, pistachio, and so it's a great dish in and of itself. So, but it has another dimension which is worth talking about, and it very neatly brings us back to the very start of our discussion, because the Qahiriyya is one of those dishes that we find in a number of cookery books. It's found, in fact, in 5 cookery books, ranging from the 13th to the 15th centuries. And what's more, we find it in cookery books from across the Muslim world. So there's a recipe for a Qahiriyya in the anonymous Andalusian cookery book, of which we just saw a manuscript page. There's also a Qahiriyya recipe in another Andalusian cookery book. There's a recipe in a Syrian 13th century cookery book, Al-Wuzla al-Habib, that we've already mentioned a couple of times as well in the course of our discussion. And then, of course, in Ibn Mubārak Shāh's book, as well as in Kanz al-Fawaid. So what is interesting here, and you might imagine, well, when it comes to something like this, surely they're more or less the same. Well, if you look closely at the recipes, you find out some very interesting things. And the most interesting thing is that none of the recipes have all of the same ingredients.
Wow.
There's only 2 ingredients that you find in all of these recipes in the various cookery books. That's sugar and that's flour.
That's wonderful.
Some cookery books use pistachios and no almonds. Some use rose water is another one.
Yeah.
Rose water, all of them have rose water. A few have musk as well. But then you have some that have pepper, for instance, galangal, walnuts that are put in the recipe of the Qahiriyya. Perhaps
regional variations.
Yes, exactly. Regional and chronological.
Yeah, sure.
So it's very interesting to use that as a kind of test case for how the cuisine traveled, which is, of course, what is most interesting to the food historian, how they travel, how they change. And of course, this sweet is one that most people living in the Middle East would know without knowing it. You can imagine what it tastes like without even making it, because there are a number of sweets, of course, that are quite similar. And the use of julab, the use of honey, the deep frying, the drenching in syrup, all these wonderful things that, of course, our doctors don't want us to eat in order to protect us from the big bad cholesterol. But every now and again, when in moderation, remember, that is another basic principle of Islamic medicine. It should be tasty, but it should always be eaten in moderation.
Yeah, moderation and balance, I suppose, like balance all exactly. the humors and the hot and the cold and the dry and the wet. Yeah, something we should definitely wisdom in that. I think we've been overlooking that for some centuries. It's good to get a refreshed idea with it. Jumping to a quick Q&A, what are you reading or watching right now?
What am I reading? I'm reading a fantastic book that I'm writing a review on, and it's a book called A Physician on the Nile, and it's the travelogue by a man called Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi, who was in Egypt in the late 12th, early 13th century. So he met Salah ad-Din, and he wrote a book about Egypt. It was going to be a big book on the history of Egypt and so on. And it's a wonderful book because, well, he's quite the character. He's a physician, philosopher, one of these medieval polymaths. He does everything. And he makes this very wonderful, writes this wonderful description of Egypt. And so it's a treasure trove of information about Egyptian life and, of course, also food. He discusses the things that the Egyptians eat, the special dishes that are found in Egypt. And a funny fact about him and his interest in food is the fact that he was born in Baghdad, wait for it, in Darb el-Faludaj. Now, if that doesn't predestine you to be a lover of food, I don't know what does.
Absolutely. Amazing. A physician by the Nile, you said?
A physician on the Nile. So it's a new edition and translation of the book.
Thank you for this. I would assume that you would like to shadow him for a day then, answering the next question.
Well, to be honest and to be somewhat cowardly, I'd have to say no, because he's writing in a very, very gruesome period in Egyptian history, because at the beginning of the 13th century, 1200, 1202, there is a terrible famine. And so I don't think I'd want to be in that position. Incidentally, the man is also famous because he made two discoveries about human anatomy that in fact predate the discoveries in Western Europe. So even from that perspective, it's an interesting and very important book. Well, I'd say if I can take anybody, it would have to be the king of poets, Abu Nuwas, because I think he would be a blast to hang out with for a day. And don't forget, I would be able, because that's part of the deal, I hope, is that when I hang out with him, I'll be able to meet all these other wonderful people, all these scholars that were alive at that time. So I think it would be a day that I or anybody else wouldn't forget, I think.
Yeah, that would be one hell of a gang to hang with, for sure. All right, and other than Qahiriyya, what would be your midnight guilty pleasure?
I try not to eat late in the evening for health reasons, but I do enjoy chips or fries, as depending on which part of the world you're from. So I guess chips would be kind of a guilty pleasure in that sense.
Chips and not crisps, right?
Exactly.
Okay. And then what dish reminds you most of home?
Oh, that would be...
What is home? What is home to you? Is it Durham?
Yes, okay. Durham, but home now would be, I guess, a Korean barbecue, because we eat a lot of Korean food as well.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. I apologize for some of the noise. My neighbors are doing construction in the house, so if that is a little noisy, I apologize for that. All right, well, I wish that we had some time for doing a quick audience Q&A. But I do see that we ran out of time. It's been an amazing conversation. There are some really valuable comments that I've been quickly going through in the comments from Charles, commenting on perhaps a theory of the etymology of mur, and Tutmaj, linking to present-day Kazakh, and
yes,
Taj as well, linking to aspic, which is really interesting. Thank you for that. And I'm just going through quickly. Miranda seems to have forgotten the health benefits of ingredients like saffron and cumin in today's time. Just a quick one. We'll take this only question. Can you identify, Daniel, a point in history where these ingredients moved into the culinary world, leaving behind their medicinal qualities? Now we add them because the recipe says so, rather than knowing why. If you can briefly answer that.
I think that must have been very early on, because you could argue that when we cook, we don't necessarily think of the health benefits. And I mean, especially something like saffron, you know, it's kind of called the queen of spices for a reason. So I think that must have happened very early on. There is a link, however, in some cases that might be worth pointing out, and that is in the use of sugar. Sugar, of course, also introduced into Europe by the Arabs. Sugar, initially, of course, people only used honey. And sugar was actually the result of physicians that came to Baghdad from a place called Jundishapur in the east, in Afghanistan now. So sugar was very expensive, but was also endowed with health benefits, how times have changed. So this is an example where, at least in the beginning, but of course soon afterwards, the medicinal, as you said earlier, the medicinal aspects are forgotten and people simply use them for their, because of the flavors and culinary enjoyment.
Amazing. There's one more question, but perhaps it's about the influence of Arab Andalusian cuisine specifically, not Arab, Andalusian cuisine on European culture. And then Raed is also requesting to have a short explanation for the disappearance of certain flavors, but unfortunately, we're really pressed with time. I'd love to wrap up. Unfortunately, sadly, I have to wrap up. But whoever sent the questions, perhaps can reach out to Professor Daniel. This is his email, and we have, so your Instagram handle is Medieval Arab Cooking, and your blog is Eat Like a Sultan. And I'm sure you'll be able to get back to them with helpful and valuable answers. With that, I thank you, Professor Daniel, so much for this conversation. Really informative, very interesting, and we'll have to have another part 2 to continue because the questions we're not done with the questions. I myself have a lot more. Would love to perhaps do that again at another chance. Thank you, Professor, for joining us, and thank you everyone for tuning in and reaching out with the comments and questions and joining us tonight. I'm Salma Sirri, and I was your host for today's afikra Matbakh talk. To give us feedback, you can head to our website, and as always, any contributions are really appreciated. Thank you very much, and good evening, good morning, good night, wherever you are.
Thank you so much, Salma. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Daniel.